Have you ever heard of a wild predator raised not by humans, but by dogs? In the middle of a snowstorm in Alaska, a lone figure limped through the frozen forest. Barely alive, barely breathing. That figure was a wolf pup. And what happened next would change everything. For him, and for the creatures who chose to love him. Picture this. The wind howling through ancient pines, snow falling so thick you can't see 5 feet ahead. The temperature, 30 below zero. In conditions like these, nothing survives alone. Nothing should survive alone. But there, stumbling through drifts higher than his tiny body, was a wolf pup no bigger than your hand. His gray fur was matted with ice, his amber eyes barely open, his breathing so shallow it was almost gone. He collapsed just 50 yards from a remote cabin, where 2 dogs would make a decision that defied every law of nature. This wasn't just any cabin. This was the edge of the world where civilization ended and the true wilderness began. The kind of place where you either learn to trust your instincts, or you don't make it through the winter. The first dog to find him was Ranger, a massive German shepherd whose job was to protect this isolated homestead. Ranger had seen wolves before. He'd chased them away, fought them off, understood they were the enemy. But when he looked down at this tiny, dying creature, something shifted. Maybe it was the way the pup's breathing was so faint, so desperate. Maybe it was how small he looked against the endless white. Or maybe, just maybe, Ranger saw something beyond species. He saw a baby who needed help. The second dog was Willow, a golden retriever whose heart was bigger than the Alaskan sky. Where Ranger was the protector, Willow was the nurturer. She had lost her own puppies that spring, and when she saw this little wolf, every maternal instinct she had came flooding back. She didn't see a predator. She didn't see the enemy. She saw a child who was dying, and she couldn't let that happen. What these 2 dogs did next would challenge everything you think you know about nature, about family, about love itself. They carried that wolf pup inside, and from that moment, their lives, and his, would never be the same. They named him Shadow because he followed them everywhere, a dark silhouette against the white snow, never more than a few steps behind. But here's what no one could have predicted. As Shadow grew stronger, as he became part of their unlikely pack, the wild would come calling. And when it did, he would face an impossible choice, between the family that saved him and the forest that made him, between safety and instinct, between love and belonging. This is the story of a wolf who learned what it meant to be loyal, what it meant to sacrifice, and what it meant to find your place in a world that doesn't understand you. It's a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about family, about home, about where we truly belong. Because sometimes the most powerful bonds aren't the ones we're born with. They're the ones we choose. If this story already moved something inside you, there's more to come. Join our pack by subscribing now. We bring powerful stories like this every week. The cabin where Shadow found his second chance at life wasn't just remote. It was completely cut off from the modern world. Nestled in a valley between 2 towering mountain ranges in northern Alaska, it was accessible only by a single dirt road that became impassable for 6 months of the year. During the worst storms, even helicopters couldn't reach it. This was where Jack Morrison, a former park ranger, had chosen to spend his retirement with his 2 faithful companions. Jack had built this life deliberately. After 30 years of dealing with crowds, regulations, and the constant noise of civilization, he wanted silence, he wanted space. He wanted to live on nature's terms, not society's. The cabin itself was simple but sturdy. Thick log walls, a stone fireplace that heated the entire space, and windows that looked out onto endless wilderness. Solar panels provided minimal electricity, and a well gave them fresh water. Everything else came from the land or from monthly supply runs to the nearest town, 40 miles away. Ranger had been with Jack for 8 years, a retired K-9 unit who'd served with distinction before an injury ended his career. He was massive, 90 pounds of muscle and intelligence with scars on his muzzle from his service days and eyes that missed nothing. Ranger understood his job: protect Jack, protect the property, and keep the wild animals at a respectful distance. He'd tangled with bears, chased off mountain lions, and yes, he'd faced wolves before. But he was getting older now, his black and tan coat showing gray around the edges, his movements just a little slower than they used to be. Willow was different. She'd come to them as a rescue, found abandoned on a highway with a litter of puppies that didn't survive. Jack had fostered her initially, but when it came time to find her a permanent home, he realized she'd already found it. Willow had a gift for sensing emotion, for knowing exactly when someone needed comfort. Her golden coat seemed to catch and hold sunlight even on the darkest days, and her brown eyes radiated a warmth that could melt the coldest heart. The three of them had developed their own rhythm over the years. Mornings began before dawn, with Jack checking the weather and planning the day's work while the dogs patrolled the perimeter. Afternoons were for maintenance, chopping wood, fixing whatever the last storm had damaged, preparing for the next challenge. Evenings were for quiet companionship by the fire, the only sounds the crackling logs and the distant calls of the wild. It was into this carefully balanced world that Shadow arrived. At first, he was barely alive, a tiny bundle of gray fur that fit in Jack's palm. They set up a makeshift nursery by the fireplace, feeding him every few hours with a bottle, keeping him warm with heated blankets. Jack was skeptical about their chances. Wolf pups were notoriously difficult to raise, and this one had been on the edge of death. But Ranger and Willow had other plans. From the moment Shadow opened his eyes, those startling amber eyes that seemed to hold depths of ancient wisdom, they claimed him as their own. Ranger, despite his training and instincts, appointed himself the pup's guardian. He would lie beside the makeshift bed for hours, his massive head resting protectively near the tiny wolf. When Shadow whimpered, Ranger would nudge him gently with his nose. When Shadow tried to wander too far from the fire, Ranger would carefully guide him back. Willow's maternal instincts took over completely. She groomed Shadow as if he were her own puppy, her rough tongue cleaning his fur and stimulating his circulation. She regulated his temperature, pressing close when he was cold, moving away when he got too warm. Most remarkably, she began producing milk again, something that shouldn't have been possible. But love has a way of making the impossible happen. As weeks turned to months, Shadow grew stronger. His legs became sturdy enough to support his weight. His coordination improved and his personality began to emerge. He was curious about everything, fearless in a way that both charmed and worried Jack. He would tumble around the cabin, chasing dust motes in the sunlight, pouncing on Willow's tail, trying to match Ranger's serious demeanor with his own stern expressions that only made him look more adorable. But even as Shadow integrated into their little family, there were signs that he was different. His howls, which started as tiny squeaks, gradually developed into something wild and haunting that made the hair on Jack's arms stand up. His play was more intense than a dog's, more focused, more purposeful. And sometimes, late at night, he would sit by the window and stare out at the forest with an expression that seemed far too old for his young face. By the time Shadow reached his first birthday, he had grown into a magnificent creature that straddled two worlds. Standing nearly as tall as Ranger but leaner, more angular, he moved with a grace that was purely wild. His coat had developed into a beautiful blend of grays and silvers, with white markings around his chest and black tips on his ears. But it was his eyes that truly set him apart, those amber orbs that seemed to hold secrets the domesticated world couldn't understand. The first signs of change were subtle. Shadow began sleeping less during the day and becoming more active at night. Jack would wake to find him standing by the windows, perfectly still, his head cocked as if listening to sounds that human ears couldn't detect. Sometimes he would whine softly, a sound that was neither entirely dog nor entirely wolf, filled with a longing that made Willow pace nervously around him. The howling started on a night in late autumn. Jack was awakened by a sound that raised every hair on his body, a long, mournful call that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. He found Shadow on the front porch, his muzzle pointed toward the moon, releasing sounds that spoke of ancient memories encoded in his DNA. It wasn't learned behavior. It was something fundamental, something that came from the core of what he was. Ranger's reaction was immediate and protective. The old German shepherd would position himself between Shadow and the forest, as if trying to block whatever was calling to the young wolf. His body language spoke of concern, of a deep understanding that something precious was slipping away. When Shadow howled, Ranger would whine and nudge him, trying to redirect his attention back to the family. back to safety. Willow's response was even more heartbreaking. She would press close to Shadow during these episodes, her warm body a reminder of comfort and security. She would lick his face, trying to soothe whatever was troubling him. But her brown eyes reflected a sadness that Jack had never seen before. It was as if she understood that the child she had raised and loved was being called to a place where she couldn't follow. The behavior escalated as winter deepened. Shadow began disappearing for hours at a time, always returning before Jack could organize a search, but coming back with a wildness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. His scent was different too, carrying traces of the deep forest, of things that belonged to a world beyond the cabin's warm walls. One morning, Jack found tracks in the snow that made his blood run cold. They were wolf tracks, much larger than Shadow's, circling the cabin at a distance that suggested careful observation. The pack was watching. They knew one of their own was here, living among dogs and humans, and they were calling him home. Shadow's response to these visits became increasingly agitated. He would pace the cabin's perimeter, his movements sharp and anxious. The playful creature who had tumbled around their living room was being replaced by something more serious, more purposeful. His games with Willow became rougher, more intense, until she began to flinch away from his enthusiastic pounces. His respect for Ranger remained, but there was a new quality to their interactions, a testing as if Shadow was measuring himself against the older dog's authority. The change wasn't just behavioral, it was physical too. Shadow's muscles developed in ways that domestic dogs didn't, becoming lean and powerful, built for endurance rather than companionship. His jaw grew stronger, his teeth sharper. When he looked at Jack now, there was still affection there, still recognition, but also something more complex, a kind of evaluation that made the old ranger uncomfortable. The crisis point came during a particularly severe storm. The wind was howling so loudly that it nearly drowned out the sound when Shadow began to howl back. But this time was different. This time, the forest answered. From multiple directions came the response, a chorus of wild voices that seemed to surround the cabin like a council of elders calling their lost member home. Shadow's reaction was electric. He launched himself at the door with such force that Jack thought he might break through it. When that failed, he ran to every window, pawing at the glass, his calls becoming more frantic, more desperate. Ranger tried to calm him, but Shadow snapped, not viciously, but with a clear message that interference wouldn't be tolerated. For 3 hours, the calling continued. The wild pack circled the cabin just beyond the tree line, never close enough to be seen clearly, but close enough that their presence was unmistakable. Shadow threw himself against every barrier that kept him inside, his cries becoming increasingly distressed. When dawn finally came and the calling stopped, Shadow collapsed by the door, exhausted and breathing heavily. Willow approached him cautiously, her maternal instincts warring with a new fear. When she tried to comfort him as she always had, Shadow turned away, not cruelly but with a finality that spoke of a decision being made. Jack realized with a sinking heart that they were losing him. The wolf they had saved, the family member they had loved and nurtured, was being reclaimed by forces older and stronger than the bonds they had built. The question wasn't whether Shadow would leave, it was when, and whether their love had taught him enough about loyalty and sacrifice to remember them when the wild had fully claimed him. But none of them could have predicted what would happen when Shadow finally answered that call. None of them knew that sometimes the wild doesn't welcome back those who have lived too long in the company of humans. And none of them could have imagined that this rejection would set in motion a chain of events that would test every bond they had built, every lesson they had learned about love and family and what it means to belong. What would you do if your own kind turned you away? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters. The morning Shadow made his choice dawned clear and cold, with that particular quality of light that only comes after a fresh snowfall. Jack woke to an unusual silence. No scratching at the door for morning patrol, no soft whining for breakfast. The cabin felt different, emptier somehow, even before he confirmed what his heart already knew. The front door stood slightly ajar, pushed open from the inside. In the snow beyond the porch, a single set of tracks led toward the tree line. Not the meandering path of a dog exploring, but the purposeful stride of a wolf with a destination in mind. Shadow had made his decision during the night, slipping away while his human and canine family slept. answering a call that had grown too strong to resist. Ranger found the open door first, his aging body stiff with alarm as he pushed through to the porch. His massive head swung back and forth, reading the story written in scent and tracks. When Jack joined him, the old German shepherd looked up with eyes that reflected a pain too deep for words. They both understood. Shadow was gone, drawn into the wilderness by instincts older than love, older than loyalty. Willow's reaction was the most heartbreaking. She emerged from the cabin and immediately began following Shadow's trail, her nose pressed to the snow, her tail low and worried. Every few steps she would stop and look back at Jack and Ranger, as if asking why they weren't following, why they weren't bringing their boy home. When Jack gently called her back, she obeyed, but her brown eyes remained fixed on the forest, hope and confusion written across her gentle features. For 3 days they waited. Jack told himself it was natural. Shadow was young, curious, and the pull of his heritage was strong. Maybe he just needed to explore, to understand what he was before returning to the safety of home. Ranger maintained his vigil by the window, occasionally releasing low whines that carried across the valley like prayers. Willow barely ate, spending most of her time by the door, ears perked for any sound that might signal Shadow's return. On the 4th morning, that sound came, but it wasn't what any of them expected. The howl that woke them wasn't the confident call of a wolf claiming territory or celebrating a successful hunt. It was desperate, panicked, filled with a terror that made Jack's blood freeze in his veins. Ranger was on his feet instantly, every protective instinct activated. Willow bolted for the door, her maternal alarm overriding everything else. Jack grabbed his rifle and followed the dogs into the pre-dawn darkness. The howling continued, closer now, and underneath it they could hear something else. Snarling, the sound of conflict, of rejection being violently enforced. They found Shadow in a clearing about half a mile from the cabin, and the scene that greeted them would haunt Jack for the rest of his life. Shadow stood alone in the center of the clearing, his body language screaming submission and confusion. Around him, keeping their distance but making their message clear, were 5 adult wolves, the pack that had been calling to him for months. But instead of the welcome Shadow had expected, instead of the acceptance he had left his family to find, he was being systematically rejected. The pack leader, a massive gray male with scars across his muzzle, approached Shadow with stiff-legged dominance. His message was clear in the universal language of wolf politics. This outsider, this creature that smelled of dogs and humans, was not welcome. When Shadow tried to approach, tried to demonstrate his submission, the leader snapped, his teeth missing Shadow's muzzle by inches. One by one, the other pack members reinforced the rejection. They surrounded Shadow, not to accept him, but to assess him, and what they found was wanting. His scent was wrong, contaminated by months of living with domesticated animals. His body language was off, too trusting, not wary enough for a creature that had grown up truly wild. Most damning of all, his responses to their signals were just slightly incorrect, like someone speaking a language they had learned rather than one they were born to. The rejection escalated quickly. When Shadow persisted in trying to prove his worthiness, the pack's patience ran out. They began snapping more aggressively, their snarls becoming more threatening. Shadow, confused and hurt, tried to fight back, but he was outnumbered and, despite his wild genetics, unprepared for the ruthless politics of pack dynamics. The attack, when it came, was swift and decisive, not meant to kill, but to drive away, to make it clear that this creature who walked between worlds belonged in neither. Shadow fought back as best he could, but years of gentle play with Ranger and Willow hadn't prepared him for this. He was bleeding from several wounds when he finally broke free, running not toward deeper wilderness, but back toward the only home he had ever really known. Jack, Ranger, and Willow met him at the forest's edge. The sight of Shadow, bloodied, limping, his amber eyes wide with hurt and confusion, broke something in all of them. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. In the stories, the wild wolf returned to his people and found acceptance, found his place in the natural order. But reality was harsher than stories, and Shadow had learned the cruelest lesson of all, that sometimes home isn't where you come from, but where you're truly accepted. Willow reached him first, her gentle tongue immediately beginning to clean his wounds, her soft whines offering comfort that the wild had refused to give. Ranger positioned himself protectively between Shadow and the forest, his message clear. Whatever had hurt their family member would have to go through him first. But as they helped Shadow back to the cabin, none of them realized that his rejection by the wild pack had been witnessed by other eyes. In the shadows of the trees, something much larger and more dangerous than wolves had been watching, waiting for its moment. Shadow's vulnerability, his isolation from both worlds had made him, and by extension his adoptive family, a target for a predator that respected neither dog nor wolf, neither human nor wild creature. The grizzly bear that had been denning near their valley had caught the scent of blood, the sound of conflict, and had recognized opportunity. Shadow's painful lesson about belonging was far from over, and the greatest test of his loyalty was yet to come. The silence that followed their return to the cabin was different from any quiet they had experienced before. It wasn't the comfortable stillness of their remote sanctuary, nor the expectant hush that preceded a storm. This was the heavy, oppressive silence that comes when nature itself holds its breath, sensing that something has shifted in the delicate balance of the wilderness. Shadow's wounds were not severe, mostly superficial cuts from teeth meant to warn rather than maim, but the emotional damage ran much deeper. He lay by the fireplace where he had spent his first weeks of life, but now his amber eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there before. The confident young wolf who had answered the call of the wild had returned as something else, a creature caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Jack tended to the physical injuries while Willow provided emotional comfort, her gentle presence a constant reassurance that here, at least, love was unconditional. Ranger maintained his protective vigil, but there was something different in his posture now, a tension that spoke of senses picking up subtle changes in their environment. The first sign that something was wrong came 2 days later. Jack was splitting wood behind the cabin when Ranger's sharp bark cut through the afternoon air. Not the warning bark he used for deer or the occasional moose, but something more urgent, more alarmed. Jack looked up to see Ranger standing rigid at the edge of the clearing, his hackles raised, staring into the tree line with an intensity that made the old ranger reach for his rifle. Willow emerged from the cabin, her usual calm demeanor replaced by nervous energy. She sniffed the air repeatedly, whining softly, her body language screaming that something was very wrong. Shadow, despite his recent trauma, struggled to his feet and joined them, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that made every instinct he possessed trigger at once. The tracks they found the next morning told a story that chilled Jack to the bone. Massive paw prints in the snow, each one nearly the size of a dinner plate, circled the cabin at a distance that suggested careful observation. The stride length indicated an animal of enormous size, and the depth of the impressions in the packed snow spoke of incredible weight. But it was the claw marks on the trees that made Jack's hands tremble as he examined them. Gouges in the bark 8 feet off the ground, made by claws as long as his fingers. A grizzly bear. Not just any grizzly, but a massive male, probably weighing close to 800 pounds. And from the pattern of tracks, it had been watching them for at least 2 nights, learning their routines, assessing their defenses. The behavior was unusual for this time of year. Grizzlies should have been deep in hibernation, but climate changes and a poor berry season had left some bears active longer, more desperate, more dangerous. This one had been denning in the high country, but the scent of domestic animals and the recent commotion from Shadow's encounter with the wolf pack had drawn its attention. That evening, the normal sounds of the wilderness fell silent. No wind through the trees, no calls from night birds, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the distant howling of the wolf pack, which had become a nightly occurrence, was absent. Nature had gone quiet, the way it does when an apex predator is on the move. Jack barricaded the doors and windows, his military training kicking in as he prepared for a siege he hoped wouldn't come. He cleaned his rifle, checked his ammunition, and tried to think of contingency plans for defending a log cabin against an animal that could tear through wood like paper. Ranger seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, positioning himself by the front door, his ears constantly swiveling to track sounds that human ears couldn't detect. Willow's reaction was the most telling. The gentle golden retriever, who had never shown fear of anything in her life, began to shake. Not from cold, but from a primal terror that came from somewhere deep in her genetic memory. She pressed close to Shadow, as if her presence could somehow protect him from what was coming. The attack on their peace of mind began with sounds. Heavy footsteps circling the cabin just beyond the reach of their solar-powered security lights. The creak of wood under enormous weight as something tested the strength of their porch supports. Most unnerving of all was the sound of breathing. Deep, deliberate inhalations that seemed to be analyzing every scent, cataloging every weakness. On the third night of this psychological warfare, they heard something that made Jack's blood turn to ice water. Ranger was no longer by the door. His usual post was empty, and when Jack called for him, there was no response. A frantic search of the cabin revealed nothing. Somehow their protector had vanished without a sound. They found Ranger at dawn, alive but barely conscious, lying in the snow 50 yards from the cabin. He had been struck by something powerful enough to send his 90-pound body flying, but not quite powerful enough to kill him. His breathing was labored, his left rear leg was clearly broken, and there was blood in his dark fur. But his eyes, when they focused on Jack, held not fear, but determination. Even injured, even facing an opponent he couldn't hope to defeat through strength alone, Ranger's message was clear. He would die before he let anything harm his family. The Grizzly had made its statement. The old dog was alive only because the bear wanted him to be, wanted the psychological impact of showing what it could do. Now the real siege would begin, and somewhere in that besieged cabin, a young wolf who had been rejected by his own kind would have to decide what family really meant to him. If this moment gave you chills, show your support with a like. Your click helps these stories reach more hearts. The final confrontation came at dawn on the fourth day, when the world was painted in shades of gray and silver, and the boundary between night and day seemed as fragile as the line between domesticated and wild. Jack had been awake all night, keeping watch over Ranger's still form while Willow pressed close to Shadow by the dying fire. None of them had slept. The oppressive weight of being hunted had settled over the cabin like a burial shroud. The first sign wasn't a sound. It was the absence of sound. Even the wind seemed to have stopped breathing. Then came a noise that would haunt Jack's dreams for years to come. The splintering of wood as 800 pounds of raw fury began systematically destroying their front porch. The Grizzly had decided that the psychological warfare was over. Now came the real thing. Through the window, Jack caught his first clear glimpse of their tormentor, and the sight nearly made his rifle slip from nerveless fingers. The bear was a giant even by Grizzly standards, its massive frame seeming to fill the entire doorway. Its fur was dark brown, almost black, with silver tips that caught the early morning light. But it was the bear's eyes that truly terrified him. Not the mindless fury of a maddened animal, but the cold, calculating intelligence of a predator that had learned that humans and their companions were just another form of prey. The bear's first real assault came without warning. One moment it was testing the doorframe with almost casual swipes of its massive paws. The next, it was throwing its full weight against the reinforced wooden barrier. The sound was like thunder, like the world splitting apart. Jack's carefully constructed barricades held for the first impact, and the second, but he could see splinters flying, could hear the nails pulling free from the wood. Ranger tried to rise, his warrior's instincts overriding his broken body, but he collapsed immediately, a whine of frustration escaping his grizzled muzzle. Willow huddled deeper into the corner, her entire body trembling, her gentle nature completely overwhelmed by the violence unfolding around her. And Shadow. Shadow stood frozen by the fireplace, his amber eyes wide with a terror that seemed to paralyze every muscle in his body. The door gave way on the third impact, exploding inward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. The Grizzly filled the doorframe like a living nightmare, its massive head swinging back and forth as it assessed the interior of the cabin, deciding which victim to claim first. Its breath misted in the cold air, and Jack could see the creature's teeth, yellowed fangs as long as his thumb, designed to crush bone as easily as twigs. Jack raised his rifle, knowing even as he did that a single shot, even perfectly placed, might not be enough to stop something this massive. His hands were shaking. Not from fear for himself, but from the knowledge that he was about to watch everything he loved be destroyed, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. The bear's choice was immediate and tactical. It ignored Jack and his weapon, dismissed the injured ranger as no threat, and focused its attention on Willow. Perhaps it recognized her as the most vulnerable, or perhaps it understood that harming her would cause the most psychological damage to the pack. Whatever its reasoning, the grizzly took a step toward the corner where the golden retriever cowered. That single step broke Shadow's paralysis like a gunshot shattering glass. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. The confused, injured creature who had been rejected by his own kind vanished, replaced by something primal and magnificent. Shadow launched himself across the cabin with a snarl that seemed to contain all the wild fury his DNA had ever known, placing his body directly between the massive predator and the dog who had raised him. The bear's reaction was pure contempt. This wolf-dog hybrid was perhaps a third of its weight, armed with teeth that seemed laughably small compared to its own massive weapons. When Shadow snapped at its face, the grizzly swatted at him with casual dismissal, the way a human might brush away an annoying insect. But Shadow was no longer thinking like a domestic animal, no longer moving with the predictable patterns of a creature raised in safety. The months of identity crisis, the rejection by the wolf pack, the desperate need to prove his belonging, all of it crystallized into a fighting strategy that was pure predator cunning. He didn't try to match the bear's strength. Instead, he used speed, intelligence, and something the grizzly hadn't expected: absolute, unwavering determination. When the bear's massive paw swept toward him, Shadow twisted away, using the creature's own momentum to spin around behind it. His teeth found the back of the grizzly's thick neck, not penetrating deeply enough to cause real damage, but deep enough to send a message. This was going to be a real fight, not an execution. The bear roared its fury, a sound that shook the cabin's remaining windows and seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. It spun with surprising agility for something so massive, trying to catch Shadow in its powerful jaws, but the young wolf was already moving, darting between the creature's legs, snapping at tendons, creating chaos and confusion. For several minutes, the battle raged through the small cabin. Shadow couldn't inflict serious damage on something so much larger and more powerful, but he didn't need to. His strategy was simpler and more desperate: make the cost of staying too high, make every second of this fight more trouble than it was worth. The turning point came when Shadow made a mistake. In his effort to stay mobile, he momentarily lost track of his positioning and found himself cornered near the fireplace. The grizzly recognized the opportunity immediately, rearing up on its hind legs to bring its full weight down on the trapped wolf. For a heartbeat that seemed to last forever, Shadow looked up at the massive predator towering above him, and Jack was certain he was about to watch his adopted son die. But instead of fear, Shadow's amber eyes held only resolve. If this was how his story ended, he would make sure it was an ending worthy of the love that had raised him. The bear came down like a falling tree, but Shadow didn't try to escape. Instead, he did something that defied every survival instinct. He threw himself forward, directly into the bear's descending bulk, his teeth seeking the one vulnerable spot he could reach: the grizzly's throat. The impact drove both animals to the ground in a tangle of fur and fury. The bear's massive paws scrabbled for purchase on Shadow's body, its claws opening long gashes in his silver coat. But Shadow's teeth had found their mark, and he held on with the desperation of a creature fighting not for his own life, but for the lives of everyone he loved. The battle ended not with a dramatic victory, but with a practical decision. The grizzly, bleeding from the throat wound and frustrated by an opponent who refused to die easily, made the calculation that every wild predator understands: this wasn't worth it. There were easier meals to be found, less defended territories to claim. With a final swipe that sent Shadow tumbling across the cabin floor, the bear withdrew, backing out through the destroyed doorway with its eyes still fixed on the wolf who had dared to challenge it. The message in those dark eyes was clear: this wasn't over, just postponed. Shadow collapsed as soon as the bear disappeared, his body finally registering the extent of his injuries. Deep gashes marked his sides and legs, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. But he had done what he set out to do. Willow was safe. Ranger was alive. Jack was unharmed. The family that had loved him unconditionally had been protected, and that was all that mattered. The silence that followed the bear's retreat was different from any quiet that had ever filled the cabin. It wasn't peaceful. It was the profound stillness that comes after a storm has passed, leaving behind a landscape forever changed. Dust motes danced in the morning light that streamed through the destroyed doorway, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with the memory of violence. Shadow lay motionless on the cabin floor, his silver coat darkened with blood, his breathing so shallow that for a terrifying moment Jack thought they had lost him. The young wolf's eyes were closed, his body finally surrendering to the injuries he had ignored while protecting his family. But his chest continued to rise and fall, each breath a small miracle, a testament to the power of love over death. Jack moved first, his ranger training overriding the emotional shock of what he had just witnessed. His hands shook as he knelt beside Shadow, carefully assessing the damage. The wounds were serious but not fatal. Deep gashes that would require cleaning and bandaging, bruises that would ache for weeks, but nothing that threatened vital organs. Shadow had been incredibly lucky, or perhaps incredibly smart in how he had fought. Willow emerged from her corner slowly, her golden body trembling not with fear now, but with overwhelming emotion. She approached Shadow with the careful reverence usually reserved for the most sacred moments, her brown eyes wide with something that looked remarkably like awe. This creature, this wolf dog who had been her adopted son, her responsibility, her joy, had just risked everything to protect her. When Willow reached Shadow's side, she began the gentle process of cleaning his wounds, her tongue carefully removing dirt and blood from the gashes on his coat. It was the same nurturing behavior she had shown when he was a tiny, helpless pup, but now it carried a different weight. She wasn't just caring for a child. She was honoring a hero. The most profound moment came when Ranger finally managed to drag himself across the cabin floor. The old German shepherd's injuries made every movement agony, but he was determined to reach Shadow's side. When he finally collapsed next to the young wolf, something passed between them that transcended species, transcended the usual hierarchies of pack behavior. Ranger, the protector, the guardian who had spent his entire life defending others, carefully lowered his grizzled head until it rested against Shadow's neck. It was a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, of passing a torch from one generation to the next. The old warrior was recognizing that his time was ending, but the responsibility he had carried so faithfully would continue in capable pause. For the first time since his return from the failed encounter with the wolf pack, Shadow's expression softened into something approaching peace. Even unconscious, he seemed to sense the acceptance, the belonging he had fought so desperately to find. Not with the wild pack that had rejected him, not in the forest that had called to him, but here, in this small cabin with the creatures who had chosen to love him regardless of what he was. Jack worked quietly around them, cleaning wounds, administering what medical care he could, his own eyes suspiciously bright as he watched the reunion unfolding on his cabin floor. He had seen many things in his years as a park ranger, acts of courage, moments of profound connection between animals, instances where love seemed to overcome impossible odds. But he had never witnessed anything quite like this. The destroyed doorframe stood open to the wilderness, and through it came the sounds of normal life returning to the forest. Birds began calling again, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Somewhere in the distance, a squirrel chattered at an unseen rival. The grizzly's presence had been like a stone thrown into a pond, creating ripples of silence that had spread throughout the entire ecosystem. Now those ripples were fading. Life was resuming its normal patterns. But inside the cabin, nothing would ever be quite normal again. Shadow had crossed a line, made a choice that defined not just who he was, but who he chose to be. He wasn't a failed wolf or a confused dog. He was something entirely his own, a bridge between worlds, a creature whose identity came not from his genetics, but from his choices, his loyalties, his willingness to sacrifice for those he loved. As the afternoon wore on and Shadow's breathing grew stronger, Willow never left his side. She positioned herself so that her warm body helped regulate his temperature, her presence a constant reminder that he was not alone, would never be alone again. Ranger maintained his vigil from nearby, his own pain forgotten in his need to stand guard over the wolf who had proven himself worthy of the title family. When Shadow finally opened his amber eyes as the sun was setting, the first thing he saw was not the cabin ceiling or the worried face of his human father. It was Willow's gentle brown eyes, filled with a love so pure it seemed to glow in the firelight. And in that moment, Shadow understood something that all his searching in the wilderness had failed to teach him. Home isn't a place you find. It's a place that finds you, accepts you, and loves you exactly as you are. Where in the world are you watching this story from? Let us know. We're building a global pack. In the weeks that followed the confrontation with the Grizzly, something extraordinary happened within the walls of the damaged cabin. As Shadow healed from his physical wounds, a deeper healing began to take place. Not just in him, but in the entire family unit that had been tested by forces beyond their control. The scars on Shadow's silver coat would fade with time, but the bonds forged in that moment of ultimate crisis would prove stronger than anything nature could create. Jack spent those healing days making repairs, not just to the shattered door and damaged walls, but to his understanding of what family really meant. He had always known that love could transcend species. His relationship with Ranger and Willow had proven that years ago. But watching Shadow choose loyalty over instinct, watching him fight with desperate courage to protect creatures who weren't even his own kind, had revealed something profound about the nature of belonging itself. Shadow never again showed any interest in the howling calls that still echoed through the valley at night. When the wild pack's voices rose in their ancient songs, he would lift his head and listen with what seemed like academic curiosity. But there was no answering call in his throat, no restless pacing by the windows. The wild had tested him and found him wanting. He had tested the wild and found it lacking in comparison to what he had at home. Instead, Shadow developed new patterns, new routines that spoke of a creature who had finally found his place in the world. Each morning, he would carefully check on Ranger, whose injuries had left him permanently slowed but whose spirit remained unbroken. Shadow seemed to understand that the older dog was passing responsibilities to him, and he accepted them with a seriousness that was remarkable to witness. His relationship with Willow evolved too, from the dependent love of an adopted child to something more complex and beautiful. He became her protector now, positioning himself between her and any potential threat, but he also remained her student, allowing her to teach him the subtler arts of emotional intelligence, of reading human moods, of providing comfort through simple presence. The transformation was most evident in how Shadow carried himself. Gone was the confused creature caught between two worlds. In its place was something unprecedented, a wolf who had consciously chosen domestication, not out of weakness or fear, but out of love and loyalty. He moved with the fluid grace of his wild heritage, but his amber eyes held a warmth that was purely domestic, purely connected to the small pack he had claimed as his own. Jack began to understand that what they had witnessed wasn't just a story about a rescued wolf or even about interspecies adoption. It was something much more fundamental, a demonstration of how identity is formed not by genetics or circumstances, but by choices made in moments of ultimate testing. Shadow hadn't been born into their family. He had chosen it, fought for it, proven his membership in the most definitive way possible. The cabin itself began to feel different too. What had once been a refuge from the world became something more, a symbol of what's possible when love is allowed to transcend boundaries. Visitors were rare in their remote location, but when Jack's old ranger friends occasionally stopped by, they invariably commented on the unusual harmony they witnessed. Here was a wolf lying peacefully beside domestic dogs, all three accepting the leadership and care of a human who treated them not as pets but as equals in a complex family structure. Shadow's integration into this family had been complete, but it wasn't the integration of submission or domestication in any traditional sense. He remained fully wolf in his capabilities, his intelligence, his deep connection to natural rhythms. But he had chosen to use those wild gifts in service of domestic love, creating something entirely new, a creature who bridged two worlds not by abandoning one for the other, but by creating a third option entirely. The lesson wasn't lost on Jack, who began to see applications far beyond the walls of their cabin. In a world increasingly divided by artificial boundaries between nations, races, ideologies, Here was a living example of how belonging could be chosen rather than assigned, how loyalty could transcend genetics, how family could be formed by commitment rather than blood. Shadow's story began to represent something larger, the possibility that identity doesn't have to be limited by origin, that love can indeed conquer the deepest programming of instinct and fear. He had faced rejection from his biological family, had endured the confusion of not fitting into either world completely, but had emerged with a stronger sense of self than if he had simply followed the predetermined path of his species. The wild pack still ranged through their valley, and occasionally Jack would spot them in the distance, moving through the trees with the fluid coordination that spoke of perfect evolutionary adaptation. But Shadow no longer watched them with longing. When he observed them now, it was with the detached interest of someone who had chosen a different path and was completely at peace with that choice. The true measure of Shadow's transformation came on a crisp autumn evening, almost a year after the bear attack. Jack was reading by the fire while the three animals rested nearby, Ranger in his favorite spot by the hearth, Willow curled in the corner, and Shadow positioned where he could see both the room and the repaired doorway. Suddenly, Shadow's head lifted, his ears pricked with attention. From the forest came a sound that made Jack's blood run cold, the distressed yelping of an animal in trouble. Without hesitation, Shadow rose and moved toward the door, not with the desperate eagerness he had once shown toward wild calls, but with the purposeful stride of a protector responding to need. What they found in the forest that night was a young fox, caught in a trap set by careless hunters, injured and terrified. Shadow's response was immediate and telling. He didn't see prey or competition, but a creature in need of help. His gentle ministrations, learned from watching Willow care for him, helped free the fox and tend to its wounds before sending it safely on its way. In that moment, Jack realized that Shadow had achieved something remarkable. He had become the best of both worlds, combining the strength and instincts of the wild with the compassion and loyalty of the domestic, creating something entirely new. A creature whose identity was defined not by what he was, but by what he chose to do with what he was. Sometimes, the most powerful instincts are not to survive, but to protect. As winter settled over their valley once again, bringing with it the anniversary of Shadow's first appearance in their lives, Jack often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The cabin bore subtle reminders of their trials. The reinforced doorframe, the claw marks still visible on some of the exterior logs, the carefully tended spot where Ranger had fallen. But these weren't scars of defeat. They were badges of honor, proof that love had been tested and had emerged victorious. Shadow had grown into his full size now, standing nearly as tall as Ranger and possessing a lean, powerful build that spoke of his wild heritage. But his amber eyes, when they looked at his human and canine family, held depths of affection that no wild creature could ever achieve. He had learned something that escaped most beings, human or animal, that true strength isn't measured by independence or dominance, but by the willingness to make yourself vulnerable for the sake of others. The daily rhythms of their life had settled into a pattern that felt as natural as breathing. Shadow had assumed many of Ranger's former duties, patrolling the perimeter, alerting to potential dangers, serving as the first line of defense for their small sanctuary. But he performed these tasks with a gentleness that was uniquely his own, as if his rejection by the wild pack had taught him that aggression should always be a last resort, never a first choice. Willow, now entering her senior years, had found in Shadow not just the child she had raised, but the protector she increasingly needed. Her golden coat was beginning to show gray around the muzzle. Her steps were a little slower, but her eyes still held all the warmth and wisdom that had made her such a perfect mother to a lost wolf pup. Shadow seemed to understand her aging process intuitively, adjusting his protection to match her needs, never making her feel diminished but always ensuring she felt safe. Ranger's injuries had left him with a permanent limp and reduced stamina, but rather than relegating him to obsolescence, Shadow had found ways to honor the older dog's experience and wisdom. Often, Jack would find them together in the evening, Shadow lying attentively nearby while Ranger seemed to share silent lessons about duty, loyalty, and the weight of responsibility. It was a mentorship that transcended species, a passing of knowledge from one protector to another. The transformation in Shadow served as a daily reminder that identity is not a prison but a choice. Every morning when he chose to check on his aging companions before exploring the forest, he was choosing love over instinct. Every time he ignored the wild calls echoing through the valley to focus on his domestic duties, he was choosing belonging over biology. Every moment he spent providing comfort and protection to creatures who were not his species, he was choosing to be something larger than what nature had intended. Jack had come to understand that what they had witnessed and lived through was more than just an unusual story about interspecies adoption. It was a profound lesson about the nature of family itself. Family, he realized, isn't about shared genetics or similar backgrounds or even common interests. Family is about showing up, about making the choice again and again to put someone else's well-being above your own, about fighting for each other when fighting seems impossible. The bear had never returned, though its tracks were occasionally spotted in distant parts of the valley. Perhaps it had learned, as predators sometimes do, that some prey isn't worth the cost. Or perhaps it sensed that the dynamics around the small cabin had shifted permanently, that what had once been a collection of vulnerable individuals had become something much more formidable, a family united by tested bonds and proven loyalty. On quiet evenings, when the fire crackled in the hearth and snow fell softly outside their windows, Jack would look at his unusual family and feel a deep satisfaction that transcended any achievement from his former career. Here in this remote corner of Alaska, they had proven something that the world desperately needed to learn: that love isn't bound by species or circumstance, that belonging can be chosen rather than inherited, and that the fiercest protection comes not from those who share your blood, but from those who share your heart. Shadow would sometimes catch Jack looking at him during these peaceful moments, and the wolf's amber eyes would hold an expression that seemed remarkably human, a look that said he understood exactly how fortunate they all were to have found each other, and how precious it was to have a place in the world where you were loved not for what you were, but for who you chose to be. The wild still called from the forest beyond their walls, but it no longer called to Shadow. He had found something better than the wild, something rarer than acceptance by his own kind. He had found a family that loved him enough to let him be himself, and he had loved them enough to choose them over everything else the world had to offer. If this story touched your heart, don't stop here. Hit subscribe and watch the next video. It's right here on the screen. You won't believe what a rescued bear did after finding the man who saved him. The story of Shadow, Ranger, Willow, and Jack represents something we all desperately need in our world today. Proof that love can transcend every boundary we think matters. In an age where division seems to define us, where difference is used as an excuse for distance, this small family in the Alaskan wilderness shows us a different way forward. They prove that belonging isn't about where you come from, but about where you choose to make your stand. Think about Shadow's journey for a moment. He started as a creature caught between worlds, rejected by his biological family, confused about his identity, struggling to find his place in a universe that seemed to have no clear category for what he was. How many of us have felt exactly the same way? How many of us have stood at the crossroads between who we're supposed to be and who we actually are, wondering if we'll ever find our tribe, our people, our home? Shadow's answer came not through conforming to expectations or forcing himself to fit into predetermined boxes, but through the radical act of choosing love over genetics, loyalty over instinct, family over biology. He discovered that the most powerful identity is the one you forge through your choices, especially the choice to protect those who cannot protect themselves. This isn't just a story about animals. It's a story about what it means to be human in the deepest sense. Shadow's transformation from confused outsider to fierce protector mirrors the journey we all must take, from seeking acceptance to offering it, from wanting to belong to creating belonging for others, from being loved to loving with everything we have. The relationship between Shadow and his adoptive family teaches us that the strongest bonds aren't forged in comfort, but in crisis. It was when everything was at stake, when death was literally at their door, that Shadow discovered who he truly was. Not a failed wolf or a confused dog, but something entirely new. A bridge between worlds, a creature whose strength came from his willingness to sacrifice for others. Jack's role in this story is equally profound. As a human, he could have seen Shadow as a pet to be controlled, a wild animal to be feared, or a burden to be managed. Instead, he chose to see him as family, complex, worthy of respect, deserving of love without conditions. Jack's acceptance created the safe space that allowed Shadow's true nature to emerge, proving that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another being is simply the freedom to become who they're meant to be. Ranger and Willow represent the power of unconditional love in its purest form. They could have seen Shadow as a threat, a competitor, an outsider who didn't belong. Instead, they chose to see him as their child, their responsibility, their family member. Their acceptance was so complete that Shadow never doubted his place in their hearts, even when he doubted everything else about himself. But perhaps the most powerful lesson in Shadow's story is about protection. When the moment of ultimate testing came, Shadow didn't think about his own survival. He didn't calculate odds or consider alternatives. He saw his family in danger, and every instinct he possessed aligned around a single purpose: protect those who had protected him. In that moment, he became exactly what the world needs more of: someone willing to stand between danger and the innocent, regardless of the cost. The bear in this story represents more than just a physical threat. It symbolizes all the forces in our world that seek to destroy what we've built, to tear apart the bonds we've formed, to reduce everything to its most primitive elements. Shadow's victory wasn't achieved through superior strength or size. It was achieved through superior purpose. He had something worth fighting for, something worth dying for, and that gave him power beyond his physical capabilities. This story challenges us to examine our own lives and ask difficult questions. Who would we fight for? What would we sacrifice to protect those we love? Are we living as passive recipients of love, or as active contributors to the well-being of our families, our communities, our world? Shadow's choice to stay, to commit, to become the protector rather than the protected, offers a blueprint for how we might approach our own relationships. Too often we see love as something that serves us, something that meets our needs and fulfills our desires. Shadow's story suggests a different model: love as service, belonging as responsibility, family as a commitment that transcends convenience. The cabin where this story unfolds becomes a symbol of what's possible when we create spaces where difference is celebrated rather than feared, where identity is fluid rather than fixed, where family is defined by choice rather than chance. In their remote corner of Alaska, this unlikely group proved that the artificial boundaries we use to separate ourselves from each other are exactly that: artificial. As we face our own challenges, our own moments of testing, our own questions about identity and belonging, Shadow's story offers hope. It suggests that we don't have to choose between authenticity and acceptance, between being true to ourselves and being part of something larger. Like Shadow, we can forge new categories, create new possibilities, become bridges between the worlds that seek to divide us. The real magic in this story isn't that a wolf learned to love dogs, or that dogs learned to accept a wolf, or that a human created space for an impossible family. The magic is that they all learned to love something larger than themselves, to find identity in service rather than status, to discover that the greatest strength comes not from independence, but from interdependence. So as you go forward from this story, carry with you Shadow's lesson: that home isn't a place you find but a commitment you make, that family isn't something you're born into but something you fight for, and that the most powerful force in the universe isn't the wild call of instinct but the quiet choice to love, protect, and stand firm when everything you care about is at stake. And if you're hungry for more stories that prove love conquers all, that choice defines destiny, that family transcends every boundary, well, you're in exactly the right place. Because the story of what happened when a massive grizzly bear recognized the man who had once saved his life will challenge everything you think you know about gratitude, memory, and the unbreakable bonds that can form between the most unlikely friends. Hit that subscribe button now, because some stories are too powerful to miss and you've just become part of a community that believes in the transformative power of love.